All right, here we are again. So, and I've gone through this before, so if you haven't checked out the podcast segment I did a little bit ago where I talked about how I produce the podcast, this is one of the points of frustration for me, is that I am not able to make these segments and publish them immediately as soon as the news comes out. And so because of that, I try to have the podcast be as timely as possible. But sometimes I record and produce and upload and schedule segments that come out, and right before these segments come out, a piece of news comes out that immediately negates it. So we have to wait until the next week's episode to talk about it. Case in point, in the last week's episode of the Access Blockbusters Pod, I believe episode 53, because this is episode 54, I said, based on a report, that it looks like the Sony universe, after Kraven, is dead. And then a couple days later, what happens? A report from Variety, which, again, Variety, very reputable source in the Hollywood industry, comes out and says, actually, surprise, the Sony Spider-Man universe is not dead after Kraven the Hunter. Now, there's a little bit of nuance here, because, again, there's enough to talk about, just in that concept alone, the fact that, okay, just kidding, they're not killing this universe. But actually, within this article, there are some very interesting quotes that I want to talk about, because I think, sure, the news could just be Sony Spider-Man universe is not dead, but I think the behind-the-scenes insights into this, some of the things that actually other people are speculating about and analyzing with, like why Sony did what they did and why they're making the decisions that they're making, I actually disagree with some of them. And so we're going to talk about them. I pulled out from this article. You can go read the whole article. It's on Variety. If you just look up, Sony Universe or Kraven the Hunter and you look up Variety, it'll come up for you. But I pulled out, I think, 5 or 6 quotes here that I want to talk about. The whole article basically details the fact that, well, sure, Kraven the Hunter, not very good. They acknowledge Morbius and Madam Web, not very good. But they're not killing the universe because there really wasn't any universe to begin with. And, they can just keep making these movies and they don't necessarily have to be connected to one another. So I'm going to read through a couple quotes. I'm going to read through each quote, and then we're going to talk about what it means and what I think it means and why I might disagree with some of them. So let's look at this first quote here. This first quote says, and I'm just going to read it out and then we'll talk about it. Quote, "For one thing, technically speaking, there never really was a Sony Marvel Universe or a Sony Spider-Man Universe or any other official designation akin to the Marvel Cinematic Universe or the newly relaunched DC Universe. Sony has never approached its comic book adaptations with that level of intentional narrative cohesion, as exemplified by the studio's casual, lowercase, and rhetorically ungainly phrasing for a superhero film. Sony's universe of Marvel characters, end quote. Okay, so the thesis here, right? The assertion in this quote is that, well, is the Sony universe dead? Not really, because was there ever really a Sony universe to begin with? To which I say, okay, I'm willing to buy the premise of this. I think your actions, though, speak louder than words. And what I'm really looking at, honestly, is 2 things. I'm looking at Venom Let There Be Carnage, and I'm looking at Morbius. Now, I'm looking at Venom Let There Be Carnage because you can say all you want. That, no, sure, we were just looking to make some spin-off Spider-Man universe characters, and there was never really anything going on with them. Okay, then why in the world were you trying to cross over Venom into the MCU for a little bit? That doesn't seem like it's very self-contained at all. But fine. Maybe that's not an argument about how the Sony characters are tied together. That's just an argument about how much more Sony wanted the Venom character to be in the MCU, not the Sony universe. Okay, fine. Let's look at Morbius. What in the world were we doing bringing Michael Keaton over, right? There are hints to Spider-Man in every single one of these projects. There are hints even towards one another in a couple of these projects. What in the world are we doing? Just pretending the fact that, no, these projects aren't really related to one another. Sure. In a vacuum, you can say, well, in hindsight, none of these projects actually, you didn't see Morbius show up in Madam Web and etc. Okay, fine. Whatever, fine. Insofar as, though, the first Iron Man was not really connected to the first Thor, not really connected to the first Captain America, sure, fine. But, they were all hinting towards one another. They all had a couple things in common, and they were all making attempts to connect to each other. So, for this quote here, the premise I can accept. Okay, fine. Sure, there really isn't a formalized Sony universe of Spider-Man characters. They were not building towards the Sinister Six. Even then, I have my doubts that they weren't even thinking about that. I feel like they were at some point, but fine, whatever. But in execution, I still think that it's a little facetious to be like, there never was anything here, guys. What are you talking about, Sony universe of Spider-Man characters? But fine, that's just my opinion. Okay. Let's move on to the second quote here. This is talking about the more financial side of the Sony universe. So Quote, Sony insiders also fiercely defend the success of the 3 Venom films starring Tom Hardy, which have earned more than $1.8 billion worldwide. The latest film, Venom: The Last Dance, has earned it the lowest gross yet of the franchise, $473 million, especially against the $856 million global take for 2018's Venom. But The Last Dance cost $120 million, thrifty for a superhero movie, and it improved on the international grosses of 2021's Venom: Let There Be Carnage. So there's really no financial reason for Sony to stop making Venom movies anytime soon. This one I completely agree with. People are like, what in the world are you talking about? These movies are tanking, they're bombing everywhere. And yes, Madam Web tanked. Morbius didn't do well, although they insist Morbius made a profit. They say that in the article somewhere. I don't know how Morbius could have possibly made a profit, but fine, whatever. You insist on whatever you want. Madam Web bombed. Kraven the Hunter is going to bomb. But, I mean, guys, these Venom films, 3 Venom films, averaged $600 million each. And they cost probably at most $150 million. And this last one cost $120 million. These movies made massive profits for Sony. And on top of that, we also often forget, that Sony is getting the vast majority of the profits from the Spider-Man films. Those 3 Spider-Man films, which, by the way, have made almost a combined $4 billion. So just to say, they're not making any money or whatever. It's not money. Like, there are problems with the Sony universe, and this article talks about the fact that there are critical problems with the Sony universe, and they understand that Morbius and Madam Web were big failures, and I'm sure they're going to think the same thing about Kraven, and there's a reason for that that we'll talk about in a second, related to quality control and the fact that there is none. But in terms of money, guys, no, there is, for Sony at least. It's not like Sony sitting here going, oh no, it's just burning a hole of cash, we don't have any money anymore. No, these movies are making the money. And so I think that that's an argument that we can't, for the time being at least, because if 3 more kind of Kraven films come out and they lose $200 million each from each movie, then you might start having a conversation there. Even a Venom 4, if they ever decide to make a Venom 4 with a different character, I'm sure is probably going to make less, and then maybe we have that conversation. But no, I don't think money is necessarily the problem here with Sony. Let's move on to their this third quote here, and the rest of the article is going to reference this guy. It says his title is Exhibitor Relations Analyst. His name is Jeff Bach, and he has some takes here. And I, frankly, just to be upfront, am not going to agree with a lot of what he says, because I think that some of what he says is true, and some of what he says is, I think, very superficial. So we're going to read this third quote here, and it says, quote, this is a quote from Jeff Bach. So this Variety article is now quoting this guy named Jeff Bach. So Jeff Bach says, quote, all of these characters are famous because they went up against Spider-Man, end quote, says Exhibitor Relations Analyst Jeff Bach. Quote, unfortunately for Sony, they had a taste of success with Venom, and that kind of spoiled everything for them because they thought they could just spin off all of these characters. I don't think they realized that Venom could carry a franchise, whereas these other characters could not. To not have Spider-Man in these films was the fatal flaw. Completely 100% disagree with this. I cannot stress enough how much I disagree with this quote. This is not the reason that these films that were not Venom films failed. Those films failed because they were bad movies. And I say bad, you know me, right? If you've been watching the channel. I'm not saying bad as a prescriptive thing. If you enjoyed any one of those films, that's amazing. I'm saying critically, they were panned. People hated those movies, generally speaking, right? I'm not saying for you individually. I'm just saying generally speaking, they were panned. People said the writing was terrible, the directing was terrible, some of the acting was terrible. Hint, hint, Madam Web, hint, hint. And the reason those 3 movies, Madam Web, Morbius, and Kraven the Hunter, were bad movies was because they were bad movies, not because they didn't have Spider-Man in them. I don't know who this person is, Jeff Bach, and I again, no disrespect to you at all or anything like that, but this is a completely inaccurate statement, in my opinion, because, no, these films, if these 3 films, let's just say Madam Web, Morbius, and Kraven the Hunter averaged around the 80% Rotten Tomato mark, and they each made about $300 to $400 million. Nobody's talking about Spider-Man. The fact that Venom was successful was because the first film, critically panned, sure, but the audiences really liked it, and it made $800 million. The second film had about a 60% Rotten Tomato score, and people liked it, and it made a lot of money. The third film, again, to a lesser degree, but people like this Tom Hardy Venom dynamic. And that's why these films are successful, not because it didn't have Spider-Man. This quote baffles me, honestly. I looked at the article again, and I don't know where this is coming from, but because this quote just kind of baffles me. But anyways, we'll move on from there. So then, the fourth quote here. This is, I think, going back to the Variety article, and this is a little bit of a longer one, so we're going to read through this one as well. Okay. Quote, according to one Sony source, the deal with Disney never precluded Sony from using Spider-Man in its movies that didn't bear his name. The Spider-Verse movies, profusion of Peter Parker's, Gwen Stacy's, and other various Spider people certainly bears that out. But there was a feeling within the studio that audiences would not accept Holland's Spidey suddenly popping up in a live-action film that wasn't a part of the MCU, especially after Spider-Man No Way Home and the Marvel Studios projects Loki and Doctor Strange in the Multiverse of Madness established definitive boundaries to the Marvel multiverse. This one, again, I think is fair because and we'll get to a quote at the very end of this article that talks about what a potential solution to this could be, but in fairness, I do think that the idea that Tom Holland, without a very clear narrative reason for the multiverse, because we're now establishing multiverse rules, and I think it's totally fair because Spider-Man No Way Home was about the multiverse, that if you see Tom Holland appear next to Venom, which I think they would have loved to have had happen, I think it would have really confused a lot of people who are just following the MCU if in a trailer it was, Tom Holland fighting Venom, and they were like, what is this? Is this MCU? What do I have to watch Venom now? I think they were worried about probably damaging the relationship between Disney and Marvel, or Disney and Sony, because I think that it was well within their rights to be able to do that, to have Tom Holland's Spider-Man just show up in Venom. They could have easily done that, but I think that they were very worried about the fact that it would have been confusing for people, and I think that is actually pretty fair, honestly. So there is that. Okay, let's move on here to this. This is another. They're quoting a producer, it looks like, and so this is from the Variety article. So this is the Variety article talking, and then they're going to quote a producer. So Variety says, quote, dancing around Spider-Man without ever getting to use him also contributed to the feeling that these spin-off films were merely exercises in craven opportunism. Quote, you can feel the cynicism a mile away, end quote, says a veteran producer. Quote, they're grinding out a product and it feels like it. There's no quality control, end quote. This one I agree with. I think that, the fact that there was no quality control, I think was very evident by the fact that they literally rehired the writers of Morbius to write Madam Web, which is crazy. It was a crazy thing for them to do. But I also think that it didn't matter because they were like, well, we can't use Spider-Man, so then what are we going to do? We're just going to make these movies, And I think that is one of the downfalls of this cinematic, or not cinematic universe, but whatever this shared universe ended up being. So I think that's also very interesting. And finally, this last quote here is also Jeff Bach. And I think that, for however much I disagreed with that first quote, I think this one is an interesting one. So the Variety article is going to start off here, and then it's going to transition into a quote from Jeff Bach. So the Variety article says, quote, there is a different possibility as well. And then quoting Jeff Bach, quote, you could hire a different Spider-Man, Bach says. It doesn't have to be Tom. I agree with this. I think, there were rumors about Andrew Garfield coming back. Fine. You could have a different Spider-Man. And there have been people in the comments being like, no, you can't have multiple Batman or multiple Superman or multiple Spider-Man. Yes, you can. You totally can. In a year, within, I think, about 12 to maybe 16 months worth of time, we had 3 separate Batmen on the big screen. Granted, for sure, 2 of them were in the same movie, so it was a little less confusing. But we had Ben Affleck, we had Michael Keaton, and we had Robert Pattinson, all in the span of basically a year and a half. I don't think people are going to be that confused if we have 2 Spider-Men going on in the universe, especially because of the multiverse. I think the multiverse does a lot to just be like, okay, just different universes, we'll figure it out. I think, I don't know, maybe I'm wrong. Maybe if they did this, then people would be like, wait, what? It's not Tom Holland? But, we have Miles Morales going on. Granted, I know it's animated and whatever, but we have Miles Morales going on, Peter Parker. We can have another Peter Parker. It's fine. We can just have another universe. We had 2 or 3 different Jokers going on at the same time. We have 2 or 3 different Batmen going on at the same time. And we're going to, as well, with whoever the Brave and the Bold Batman is and the Robert Pattinson's Batman. So, again, I just think, look, this article is clearly stating... it's stating the fact that there were problems within the Sony Spider-Man universe, within, the production and the behind the scenes and whatnot. Is it saying definitively that, well, just because, we're saying that the Sony universe is not dead means that Venom 4 is in production right now? No, I don't think so. I think elsewhere in the article, they talk about the fact that they're going to be a little more discerning and a little more choosy about how and where and when which characters show up. And I think that that's a good thing. But ultimately, I feel like the headline here, which again is true. I never try to lie to you guys and to have false headlines and things. So it is true, sure, that the Sony universe, the Sony Spider-Man universe, is not dead after all. But I think it's less of the fact that we were tricked and whatever. But I think it's more the fact that, well, I think they're trying to be a little more cautious now, and maybe they're dialing it back. Maybe at first with my whole Michael Keaton Vulture thing and Morbius thing, they were like, maybe we want a big shared cinematic universe. And now at this point, I think that they are just sort of backing off. And I'm sure they will be making more movies. Like even when that decision came out or whatever that report was that said the Sony universe was dead, I was like, are we sure about that? I'm sure they are probably going to eventually make more Sony Spider-Man universe movies. And it turns out that what this really meant is that they're going to make more movies, just like we thought. But, they're going to make it more like, well, they don't all have to be related to one another, rather than having a quote-unquote reboot of the old universe. Because they're basically trying to say, well, they never were connected in the first place, so we can just make more movies, if that makes sense. It's really interesting, this whole saga. We'll have to see. I don't think we're going to get anything in 2025. Probably early 2026 at the earliest. We'll get another of these, spin-off character films, but we'll have to see how it goes from there. Guys, let me know in the comments down below what you think about this news. Sony Universe is dead, and then it's not dead. What do you think about that? Let me know in the comments down below.